All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for part 2 of our data privacy webinar series. I wonder why every time I have to speak about series of webinars, I am inclined to call them the fraud risk series. I think those got the best of me. But otherwise, you are welcome, and it's always a pleasure for us to host you and share as much knowledge as we can. We know that at the end of the day, all this information impacts your organization, it impacts your operations in a positive way. So at that, it's always a pleasure for us to have you join us. We are set to start at 2:30 East African time, and it's just a minute past. And so we will just allow 2 minutes for the rest of the presenters to join us. But in the meantime, we will do introductions. Yes, please.
There's an extreme echo on your side.
There is an echo. Okay, let me just adjust that. Are we better now? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. So we will begin with very quick introductions for us to know who's joining us for 2 minutes as we wait for the rest of the team to join in. Just tell us your name, which country you are dialing in from, and the organization you are representing, so we can know who's joining us. And that will allow us then have more focused and relevant examples to your practices. So I will just check the chat section. The introductions can be done in the chat section. Please don't put them in the question and answer section. Name, country, and the organization. And we will be starting in 2 minutes. So let's see who is introducing themselves. No one yet? I hope I can be heard. Zahir, am I heard?
Yes, you're loud and clear.
Okay, so I see they say the chat is disabled. Virginia, could you just activate the chat section? I see Owuso is joining us from Kenya. Also, he has joined us for almost all our series. It's a pleasure to have you here. Mark is telling me the chat section is being disabled. We are working around that. Virginia, just let me know when we have that active. We have Nyambura. Nyambura is joining us from Kenya. Nyambura Thangi. You need to be African enough to pronounce some of our African names. You're welcome, Nyambura. It's a pleasure to have you here. We see Kevin Ocheng. Kevin Ocheng is from Kenya. Oh, this is quite a number of people from Kenya so far. Kevin, it's good to have you here. We have Shara. Shara also says the chat section is disabled. Virginia, just let me know when that is functional so we can have it used as it should be used. We have Anthony. Anthony is also joining us from Kenya. Anthony, thanks for joining. It's a pleasure. We have Tadese, and his SCCA, he's joining from Ethiopia. It's good to have you here. Peter from Kenya. Peter, thank you for joining us. I am about to ask where the Ugandans are. I don't seem to see them making the introductions. Let's see who else is here. I see Kevin. Kevin, it's good to have you. And that brings our 2 minutes to an end. So we'll now be starting the webinar. And as I said, it's always a pleasure for us to have you join us for these sorts of forums because of the impact that we know they create. We were here on the 14th of July, and at the time we were discussing the aspects around regulation and registration with the data protection officers in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Mauritius. And today the conversation will be going even deeper to discuss the data, the roles around data privacy. And we again have our presenters who live and breathe data protection. We have Yuv. Yuv is a data protection expert. He's been practicing for a couple of years. And so to this conversation, he brings that experience. He brings the knowledge that we need for us to move in a smoother direction. We have Amit. Amit introduces the legal aspect to this. Amit is a data protection lawyer. He's been practicing for over 10 years. We have Zahir. Zahir is a partner in charge of internal audit and forensics in BDO East Africa. He's a man that needs no introduction usually. You've seen him on all our webinars. So Zahir, I'll just let you talk us through what we can expect for this webinar and the series to come, and then you can kick us off with the conversation of the rest of the presenters. Zahir?
Certainly. Thanks a lot, Moses, and a very warm welcome to all of the participants. We've already got 50% more participants than we did last time, and that's great. I'm sure the number is going to increase as we go through the series. You're all very, very welcome. This is an exciting series, Key Roles in Data Privacy. We're then going to go on to the compliance journey, and then we'll look at data protection laws. And finally, we will be talking about tips to avoid complaints from regulatory bodies. But within these seminars, there's going to be a lot more discussed. So please invite your colleagues from all organizations, particularly in terms of compliance and also in terms of strategy. And you'll see why I'm talking about strategy. Invite them to join, and yeah, let's have some fun together. So it's my pleasure to be here again with you. I'm going to start by first giving you a little story. And the story involves a young man. This young man traveled to a far distance, a long, long time ago. And he traveled in search of education. And when he got to this land, it took him a couple of days to actually arrive at this far distance land. And when he got there, he enrolled himself into a prestigious learning institution to learn computer science. And then he returned to his country of origin, and he started looking for a job. And he started looking for a job, but he couldn't find anything relevant or related to what he'd learned. In those days, we're talking about the 1980s, the term information technology or IT, the acronym for IT, was not known. It had been coined a couple of years before, but it was not known. So we use it very commonly today, but in those days it was not known. So looking for an IT job was like asking somebody, a very, very tough question. Eventually, this young man had no options but look for another career, and he ended up becoming a bean counter or an accountant. Now, this young man is sitting here in front of you. It's yours truly, myself. And the country I came back to was Kenya. And we're talking about the early 1980s. If you remember, in those days, I'm not sure, I think a lot of you actually don't know a world without mobiles. You don't know what it was like living without a mobile phone, and certainly living without internet. But actually, there was life before internet, and there was life before mobile phones and before IT. So back in those days, I'm not sure how many of you know what the size of a computer was. I mean, the larger computers could fill up an entire room. And I know in the next couple of years, we're going to have computers that are the size of your fingernail, or maybe even smaller. In fact, just an interesting fact, one of the first computers that was made was a computer called ENIAC. And it took 3 years for them to build it, from 1943 to 1946. And that computer was driven by 18,000 vacuum tubes. And it was 1,800 square feet in size, which is the size of a 3-bedroomed flat or a 3-bedroomed house. And it weighed 50 tons. So that's computers for you. Obviously, we don't see large computers these days. You know, we can fit one in the palm of our hands. So going back to that time, nobody in those days thought IT could be used in the way we use it today. Especially, nobody thought IT was a competitive advantage. IT was, for everyone, a compliance cost. That's all it was. It was just an extra cost. It was an extra burden on organizations. You know, they were having to use IT to do various things, and people didn't like it. In fact, I remember in my first job, this was again in the 80s, my first firm, which was one of the big 4 accounting firms, did not have a single computer. And they were, all audit reports were on typewriters that had a little bit of memory. And the most powerful people in the organization were the typists, because if you didn't bow down to them, literally, they wouldn't do your reports. So coming back to the present day, everybody knows now IT can be used for competitive advantage. And we know that all our businesses are looking in one way or another for competitive advantage. Either we want to increase our market share, or we want to increase our sales, or we want to increase our income or profits. And in all of these areas, data plays a prominent role. So what do we do these days? A lot of people are sort of trying to revamp their processes. They're trying to make them more effective, more efficient in a bid to reduce their costs. Some people, manufacturers, for example, they specialize in negotiating lower costs for their raw materials. Other people use marketing as a differentiator. Some people use technology as a differentiator. Others will use their skills because they have expertise. They've been in that particular field for decades. But very few people actually would think of privacy as a differentiator, and privacy or data privacy as a tool for competitive advantage. But in fact, that is where we're going now. And I think what's going to happen in the next couple of years is those organizations that move and make the first move on data privacy are the ones that are going to be years ahead. If you think back, the companies that are raking in the billions, the giants of today, they were all people who realized that IT, that a computer could be used for amazing things. And they started investing in data a long time ago. And today, I mean, you know, they are the biggest companies in the world, making all the money in the world. So what has happened is, as people have got into data, there's also been a lot of breaches. And if you're following the news, we know that data privacy breaches don't come cheap. I mean, some of the largest breaches, Amazon, for example, they've had a fine. You know, these breaches are a percentage of your turnover, of your sales. So Amazon's been fined euros 746 million. How much is that in Kenya shillings? You put another 2 zeros at the back of that and multiply it by 1.3. WhatsApp has been fined 225 million euros. Google, 90 million euros in Ireland. Google LLC, another 60 million euros. Google, another part of Google, 50 million euros. I mean, those fines are coming fast and furious. Facebook, 60 million euros. And if you ask the question, were these fines paid? These were levied by the regulators and the authorities that run the GDPR rules, the General Data Protection Regulation. What do you think? Do you think these fines were paid? Yes, they were. I mean, can you imagine Google or Amazon deciding not to pay the fines and to give up the European market? That clearly is not going to happen. So in the midst of all of that, some companies have turned this situation into, you know, their core strength, in fact, and they've actually used it as part of their key strategy going forward. So, next slide, please. Apple. Apple is turning privacy into a business advantage and not just a marketing slogan. In 2021, Apple released an iPhone update called App Tracking Technology, ATT, that allows users to opt out of sharing data with advertisers. Most iPhone users, they chose to opt out, which turned out to be a brilliant marketing topic for Apple, but it was a massive problem for others in big tech. People like Facebook, the Meta company of Facebook, they started reeling, their sales started going down because all these guys had programs that had mechanics running in the background that were used to track user behavior after seeing an ad. And they all started suffering. People like Facebook, Snap, which is the parent company for Snapchat, Peloton, a lot of these guys who actually thrive on data were reeling from that. But at the same time, Apple's stock in the third quarter rose by over 36%. And obviously, we can't say with any certainty that it was this particular strategy that made the stock rise. But yeah, it most likely played a huge role in boosting Apple's sales. And now it's not just a corporate ideal or a marketing point for Apple anymore. It's now actually a major initiative across Apple, distinguishing its products from Android and from Windows competition. The strategy is now part of all of its products, and privacy in all of, if you look at Apple's promotions on videos, you will see privacy is mentioned nearly as part of every single feature that they're rolling out, and it's getting stage time of its own. So with that introduction, I'm going to pass on to Yuv, who's going to take you through the roles in data privacy. Yuv.
Okay. So thank you, Zahir, for the insightful introduction on privacy and how organizations can use privacy in order to boost their sales and to boost the customer trust and customer satisfaction. Before I get into the description of the key roles and we have a closer look at the definitions in data privacy, let's first take stock of the privacy framework which is present around the world. So privacy laws have been trending, let's say, since late 2010s. First, with the introduction of the General Data Protection Regulation by the European Commission. This was introduced in 2016 and has been since upheld, has been since been regarded as the golden benchmark in data protection law. So the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR for short, has provided inspiration to other countries with regards to principles and requirements and obligations that organizations must respect, that organizations must comply with regards to data protection requirements. So following the GDPR, other countries have followed suit. For example, we have the Mauritius Data Protection Act, which was introduced in 2017. The Kenya Data Protection Act and the Uganda Data Protection and Privacy Act, which were both introduced by the lawmakers in 2019. So all these regulations, all these acts are quite similar in terms of principles and in terms of obligations with the GDPR, because there is this need for international harmonization in the data privacy sphere. So most of these obligations and all of these acts try to replicate what the GDPR is doing, but also they have their own specificities in terms of more day-to-day obligations, such as the DPIAs and the data subject rights requests that I think Amit will cover in the next slides. So this is to say that if you are operating in one or more jurisdictions, let's say you are an organization in Kenya, but you're also dealing with personal data from people and individuals in Europe, or you are dealing with people in Mauritius, you must also take into consideration the requirements of the privacy laws in these regions. So it is very important for you to not only abide by your local privacy laws, but also to keep track of the requirements that are applicable to your organizations. So now let's take a closer look at the definitions that we have under data privacy. Perhaps the two most important ones are that of the data controller and the data processor. The data controller is any natural or legal person, public authority, agency, or body which determines the means and purpose of processing personal data. So, in other words, the data controller can be seen as a decision maker. They determine what is the purpose of processing. That is, what are you going to do with that customer data? Are you going to use it for advertising? Are you going to use that for customer service? What are you going to do with your employee data? Are you going to perform the payroll of your employees, or are you going to provide insurance coverage with the employee data that you have collected? So all of those are examples of purposes, and as long as you are the decision maker, so you decide what is the purpose of processing, you decide for how long you are going to process that, you decide about the retention period, you are a decision maker and your organization is a data controller. On the opposite hand, we have the data processor. So once again, it can be a natural or legal person, agency, or other body who are processing personal data upon the instructions of the data controller. So they are not going to be the decision maker in this context. They are only going to act on the behalf of the data controller. Generally, data processes happen when you are outsourcing certain services of your daily business operations. Let's say you want to outsource your payroll function, you want to outsource your storage of customer data on cloud, or you're just hiring a marketing company in order to do the marketing for your organization. Whenever you are outsourcing your processing activities and you are requiring another entity to process personal data on your behalf, that entity becomes a data processor. So here we have the data controller and the data processor. And then you also have the sub-processor. The sub-processor is any natural or legal person who is contracted by the processor to process personal data on its behalf. So you see there is a chain of command here, starting from the data controller, who is really let's say the one who holds the data, who are responsible for the personal data, and then they give instructions to the data processor to process the personal data, and then the data processor can also contract another processor, the sub-processor, to process personal data on their behalf. Interestingly, what should be noted here is that a data processor cannot hire a sub-processor without the authorization of the data controller. So before, if you are a data processor, if you want to hire a sub-processor, you need to seek the authorization from your data controller. Okay. Moving on, we have the definition of third parties. So third-party controllers are similar to controllers in that they also are authorized to process the set of personal data, but they do not take any instructions from the controller. So in a typical commercial relationship, you can have more than one controllers, right? We are going to see in a few moments how can that happen, how you can have more than one controller, and what are their position and what are their role with respect to a commercial relationship. And then finally, you have a data collector. So the term data collector is specific to the Uganda Data Protection and Privacy Act. You do not have that term in the GDPR or the Mauritius Data Protection Act or the Kenya Data Protection Act, but it simply means, and it is simply applicable to all organizations who are collecting personal data. So what you should note here is that if you are collecting personal data, you should be registered as a data collector as well with the Personal Data Protection Office of Uganda. So Obviously, you will also be a data controller or data processor, depending on your role in a processing operation. But if you are also the one responsible in collecting personal data, you need to identify your role as a data collector with the Personal Data Protection Office of Uganda. So I know those terms are quite abstract and they don't make much sense right now because those are just legal definitions. So how do you think that translate into a typical business transaction? As I told you, we have some few case studies coming up and we are going to see how those roles interact with each other. Before doing that, we need to know how to identify whether you are a data controller or data processor. As I said, basically what it boils down to is as a data controller, you need to be the decision maker. And as a data processor, you only act upon the instructions of the data controller. So when I'm talking about being the decision maker, what are the kind of decisions that you do as a data controller? So when you have several entities working together, you need to ask yourself which of those entities decide to collect personal data and also decide on what type of personal data should be collected, who decides on the purpose for collecting and processing personal data. I've talked about some examples earlier about processing, let's say, the payroll of employees, about giving insurance, advertising, customer service, IT support. All of those are examples of processing operations. And all of those are examples of purposes of processing. And as a data controller, you are the one who decides what to do with the personal data. You also have to ask yourself which of those organizations determines the lawful basis for processing personal data, whether you are relying on a contract of employment or a contract of sales, or you are relying on the consent of the data subject, or you are relying on the legitimate interest of your organizations in order to process personal data. Each processing operation needs to have a lawful basis. So you need to know which one of you is really determining the lawful basis for these operations. The data controller is also going to decide who will have access to the personal data and who are you allowed to share the data with. And as I said, the data controller is also going to decide on the retention period of personal data. So in that context, when you are deciding who is the decision maker, you need to ask yourself those following questions and see which of these organizations are really being the one who is taking the decisions here. So also why you should identify your role in the data protection context. One, it is required as an organization, you are required to register with your data protection office, your supervisory authority regarding data protection. So you need to identify first whether you are a controller or a processor or a collector, and you need to register as such with your supervisory authority. Second, you have certain legal consequences. I said repeatedly that a data controller is a decision-making entity. So as the one who makes the decision, they also have more obligations, more requirements under those laws. And when you have more obligations and requirements, you also have heavier fines when you get it wrong. So, for example, you will see that the data controller is the one tasked with data protection impact assessments. They are tasked with responding to data subject rights requests. All those are going to be covered by Amit a bit later in the presentation. But that being said, you have specific requirements, specific obligations, depending on your role as a controller, as a processor, or a third-party controller. So it is really important for you to identify your role and to understand what are your requirements. And usually how we do that, how do we identify your major stakeholders and how do we identify your processors and your sub-processors? We do that through an information mapping process. Under some laws, it is known as data inventory, or under others, it is known as a record of processing activities. What it really is about mapping the data flow within your organization. So not only you're going to know about the types and purposes, the types of personal data and the purposes of processing operations, but it also is going to help you identify your stakeholders in all of your business operations, and you will be able to identify where you will need to put in place data processing agreements and data sharing agreements. And if I remember correctly, the part on data mapping will be covered in part 3 of our webinar series. So I will invite you to join our next webinar as well to have more information on what a data inventory exercise is really about. So here we have an interesting case study. As I promised, I told you we are going to have a closer look about how those different roles work in practice. So in this example, you have, let's say your organization is a data controller and you wish to outsource your payroll functions to another entity. So you outsource your payroll. So you are the data controller because you determine the purpose of processing. The purpose of processing here is to perform payroll for your employees. So you determine what is the purpose, you determine the personal data that is required, that is you are collecting the data of your employees, and you determine the retention period, that is for how long you are going to keep those records. All that will fall upon your organization as a data controller. And the organization to whom you are outsourcing that function, they are going to be a data processor because they are only going to act upon your instructions. They are going to receive the details, the payroll details from you, and they are going to calculate, they are going to perform the payroll based upon your instruction. What should also be highlighted here is that at this point, you need to implement a data processing agreement with your processor. So each time you outsource your activities, your business operations to another entity who is processing personal data on behalf of your organization, you need to implement a data processing agreement. And I also talked about third-party controllers earlier. So in this situation, in this particular case study, the data processor, the third-party processor, obviously is not going to pay your employees directly, right? They need to go through a bank. So in this case, the bank is also a third-party controller because it is not receiving instructions from the controller, but they are also going to make some key decisions with regard to this processing operation. The bank is going to decide on their own internally for how long they are going to store personal data. They are going for how long they are going to store the data and what type of personal data they need from the data processor in order to pay your employees. So here we have two decision makers, and that's why we have a third-party controller. And this is typically the case also for other independent organizations. So we here in this example, we have banks, but we also have insurance companies. We also have government authorities, public institutions, all those organizations who do not take instructions from you, but they on their own decide what type of personal data they need and for how long they are going to process. Them as well, they are going to be a third-party controller. And in this case, between your company and those third-party controllers, you will need to implement a data sharing agreement. Okay. Now, a second case study that we have is related to sub-processors. So in this situation, your company is a data controller and you want to outsource your marketing activities to another entity who is specialized in marketing, let's say. So once again, you give instructions to that company. So you are the data controller, you determine the purpose, which is direct marketing, to, let's say, to advertise your new offers and services. So you are the data controller, you outsource that to another entity who is the data processor. Now the data processor also, they need to, let's say, they need to hire another processor in order to store the contact details of your client, right? So instead of storing everything locally, they want to move everything to the cloud, and they are using a cloud-based marketing software provided by another organization. So there is another entity which is involved in this chain of operations. That entity who is providing the cloud-based solutions, they are going to be a sub-processor. And as I mentioned, before using the services of the sub-processor, the data processor needs to have the authorization from the data controller. And the sub-processor is also going to be part of the data processing agreement, which is between the controller, the processor, and the sub-processor. Okay, so that was a bit to give you more insight about the roles of the controller, the processor, and the sub-processor in practice. So how does it work on a day-to-day basis? Next, we are going to look up at the obligations of the parties. So the obligations of the data controllers, the data processors, and collectors. So data protection principles, I did mention that the laws have their own specificities and they had their own requirements in terms of DPIAs, the data protection impact assessment, and in terms of responding to data subject rights requests. But also what should be noted is that there are some universal principles which are present in all those laws. So data protection principles, they are applicable to data controllers, processors, and collectors, and establish strict conditions under which processing of personal data is permissible. So you will see that data protection principles are present in all data protection legislations that you might work under. So it is present under Article 5 of the GDPR, under Section 21 of the Mauritius Data Protection Act, Section 25 of the Kenya Data Protection Act, as well as Section 3 of the Uganda Data Protection and Privacy Act. So whatever legislation you are abiding to, those principles are quite universal and need to be complied with. So here we have the 6 main data protection principles. The first one concerns lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. Lawfulness, as I mentioned earlier, is about determining the legal basis, the lawful basis of your processing operation. And you need to determine a lawful basis in order for your processing activity, for your business operation to be considered as licit under data protection. If you do not have a lawful basis, if you do not have, if you have not made that determination, if you have not decided your lawful basis, your processing operation is going to be considered as an illicit operation, right? And then you have the principle of fairness and transparency. It all boils down here to the reasonable expectation from the data subject about how and why their personal data is being processed. So you need to be fair and you need to be transparent in your processing operations. So how do you do that? Generally, you inform the data subjects of the purposes of processing, of how and why you are processing their personal data via a data privacy notice. So either you have a data protection notice on your website, or you can communicate it directly to your consumers and employees by mail, or whenever you are putting a contract with them, you can always provide them with a notice. What's important here is that they have, the consumers and the employees, they have the right to information, and they need to be informed of how and why their data is being processed. So you have an obligation as an organization to be fair and transparent in your processing activities. Next, we have that of purpose limitation. As I said, you need to determine the purpose for your processing activity, and you need to ensure that the purpose is kept to a minimum and is necessary. So purpose limitation, you only have one purpose for each personal data that you have. So for example, let's say you have collected employee data with regards to providing them insurance coverage, so you have collected medical details, you are not going to use those same medical details to give them advertising on, let's say, health services that your organization may offer, right? So purpose limitation is to really limit the use of personal data to one specific purpose only. And that's also where the privacy notice is important. You need to be transparent, you need to be clear about a specific purpose, and you need to stick to that purpose. Then we have the principle of data minimization. Data minimization is simply about collecting the strict minimum of personal data whenever you are processing personal data. So data minimization is about collecting the strict minimum and collect information only which is necessary for your purpose of processing. So purpose limitation and data minimization work kind of hands in hands, in the sense that everything needs to be kept to a strict minimum, right? The next principle we have is that of accuracy, and accuracy, as the name suggests, is about keeping your personal data always accurate. So let's say, for example, your consumer decides, lets you know that they have changed their bank, or they have changed their physical address. They need to change, they need to have you rectify their information on your records as well. You need to have a process in place where you can rectify that information as quick as possible, because as an organization, you do not want to keep on your books inaccurate data. You need to be able to reflect the current state of affairs. You need to allow the data subject, you allow your consumers, allow your employees to rectify their data as soon as possible. So always keep data accurate. And if the data is inaccurate, or if the data is outdated, you need to take necessary steps, you need to take necessary measures so that you can rectify that as soon as possible. Integrity and confidentiality as a data protection principle relates to the triad of cybersecurity. So integrity and confidentiality simply means that you have end-to-end security for all your business operations. So from the very start, where you are collecting personal data, up to when you are deleting that personal data where it is no longer necessary, you need to always ensure that you have adequate security and organizational measures in place, so that the personal data that you are responsible for, whether you are a data controller or a data processor, all those personal data are adequately protected. Generally, it talks about access control, password protection, antivirus, firewall, all of those security measures that you can put in place in your organization, which are going to help your company in protecting the assets of your customers and employees. You're going to protect the personal data of those data subjects, right? And then finally, the last principle that we have is that of storage limitation. So I talked about purpose limitation and processing personal data only for the necessary purpose. Storage limitation is related to that. So once that purpose is no longer necessary, so let's say, for example, it is no longer necessary for you to perform the payroll of an employee who has already left your organization, you need to ensure that you have stored that personal data of that departing employee only for the strict minimum. So if it is no longer necessary for your organization to keep the details of that employee or that customer, you need to destroy that personal data as securely as possible. So that's why we talk about storage limitation, where you also need to set retention periods for each of your records containing personal data, and you need to be able to have a process in place where you can really identify records where the purpose has lapsed and where there needs to be a disposal of those records. So storage limitation as well is very important for an organization. So before we move on to the next topic, I just want to add, if if you want to abide by all those data protection principles, it will require you a full-fledged, a cross-functional privacy framework, because you will see that those those data protection principles are going to touch all of your business operations, right? So you need to really have a cross-functional, effective privacy governance framework in place within your organization to be able to abide with all those principles. And not only is this going to help you in terms of regulatory compliance, but setting up an effective privacy framework is also going to help you to uphold your brand and ethics. Zahir mentioned earlier about the case study of Apple and how they have been able to use privacy to their best interest and how they have been able to uphold their brand as a brand who respect the privacy of their consumers, and really having a cross-effective, having a full-fledged privacy framework is going to get you there. You know, to be recognized as an organization who is able to really put the customers first, the customer's interest first. So you want to retain customer satisfaction, you want to uphold customer trust, and you want to really put this brand to the forefront of your business operations. So that's how really a privacy framework can help you achieve all that. So regulatory compliance is one thing. We all know that there are several penalties and fines that you need to pay if you are not abiding by those principles, but it can also help you further than that. And really, by abiding by all those data protection principles, it also helps you to bridge the delta between between where the technologies hit your consumers and how you're collecting their personal data, and the place where where there is a comprehension of how and why their personal data is being processed. So all of that, if you want to understand more about how you really can implement an effective and cross-functional privacy governance framework, I will invite you to our next webinar, which is going to be on the 28th of September. Okay, so moving on, I will now pass it to Amit for the relationship between the different roles.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and nice to have all of you here. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. I am going to be dealing with relationship between the roles, that is data controller and a data processor. But first things first, those of you who probably were not on this first webinar, we dealt with registration. What you need to do, I don't know whether you registered with whether organizations are registered with the Data Commissioner's Office or not. We need to identify that. So in Kenya, the registration commenced on the 14th of July, 2022, and one of the questions I get asked is there a deadline for registration? I get asked this question almost on daily basis, sometimes on an hourly basis. No, there is no deadline for registration in Kenya. However, you do need to know that under Section 18 of the Data Protection Act, that's Kenya Data Protection Act 2019, you cannot act as a data controller or as a data processor unless you are registered with the ODPC. The Uganda data protection deadline was on 31st of December 2021. I don't know if they've extended the deadline, but if you wish to know what are the requirements for registration, the registration in Uganda and Kenya are very similar. So you can actually go to both respective organizations' portals, and they have got ample information. In Uganda, those of you who are based in Uganda, they also have an online portal for purposes of seeing which organization is registered. So for purposes of this particular webinar, you do need to assess if you are, for example, dealing with a controller or a processor, and if they have not registered, especially if you're in Uganda, you can go on the portal and check. Okay. Now, why I say this is if you are dealing with an organization which is not registered, and if it is required to register, my recommendation would be twofold. One, ask them why they have not registered, right? And they probably don't know about the registration, they've not complied, or there may be any other valid reason. But find out, because then if you are a controller or a processor, it does jeopardize your position as well. So, right? So that is very important to note to start with. Okay, now going into the crux of the webinar. Now, my colleague, you has already covered a number of areas, which I hope I will not overlap, but then we will now take a deeper dive more into data controllers and data processors. A lot what I will be covering on this particular slide will either be as a best practice, or it will be stated in the law either in Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, or Tanzania does not have a data protection law. So those of you who are from Tanzania, you will sooner or later be having a data protection law. I believe there is a bill which is being discussed at the moment. And so, you know, you might want to put this into best practice. Right, so getting started, data controller, my colleague told you, as you've told you, it provides instructions on how data processors engage to perform tasks on the controller's behalf and processes personal data of individuals, okay? The instructions, the acts do not state that the instructions have to be in writing, but as a matter of best practice, it is only very important to have written instructions. And the Kenya Data Protection Act mandates there has to be a written agreement in place. We will soon come to the written agreement in the next slide, but one key area to identify is that if you are going to be having different data sets, for example, if you are going to be using one data set for providing services or goods to your data, your customer, for a particular, for goods or services, your lawful basis is contract. But if you are going to be using the same data, say for purposes of marketing, then under the Kenya Data Protection Act, the GDPR, and I believe even under the Uganda Data Protection Act, or I stand to be corrected, the lawful basis is consent. So it is very important, as you said earlier, that you identify that lawful basis, because you cannot then later change. Okay. The data controller is also responsible for any personal data breach to the individual, and they normally bear the responsibility for notifying the breach to the ODPC. Only in exceptional circumstances would a data processor be responsible. So this is mostly in cases where, yes.
Amit, your voice is not clear. We've had a couple of people who've just posted. They say there's a bit of an echo.
Sorry. Is that clear? Hello? Is that clear?
It's better. It's better.
Thanks.
It's better when if you need to start speaking.
Yes. So basically, thank you, Zahir. So the data controller is directly responsible for any data breaches. So you got to understand that if there is any form of breach by the data processor, you've got to ensure that it's the data processor is also compliant with the data protection laws, and they must make sure that the whatever data protection regulations are followed by the data controller are actually followed by the processor as well. Secondly, they also must be transparent with the individuals when they share their personal data. This applies both to the data processors and the data controllers. And the other part is that the processors must inform the individual of the contact details of the processor and the personal data which the processor processes. Now, those of you who got Gmail accounts, Hotmail accounts, as practically, you might find you get emails usually on weekly basis informing you of your processors, that update of sub-processors or processors. Now, this is a requirement under the General Data Protection Regulation. It is not a requirement under the Kenya Data Protection Act, or I am assuming even the Uganda Data Protection Act. So whenever you change your processes, you have to make sure you inform those individuals, okay? The data processor usually, as you've said, is not involved in the collection, purpose, lawful basis, sharing or retention, or the end result of any data processing, and is responsible principally to the data controller as well as a regulator, okay? You also have the concept of joint controllers and separate controllers. I will not go into that at the moment. Safe to state that if, say, for example, you are a data processor acting on behalf of a data controller. So, for example, you get instructions from a data controller for purposes of processing one piece of data, say for purposes of you are an audit firm, or you are processing that data only for purposes of one particular say selling goods. But then you decide on your own volition as a processor that you are going to be using that data for marketing. What that means, you then become a controller automatically by virtue of the law. So you have to be very sure what your instructions are, and they have to be very, very clear, okay, between the controllers and the processors. Then you can also, there's also the concept of separate controllers, okay? Separate controllers are essentially both of you have the same data, but then you say one party is going to process the data for purposes of certain activities, and the other person, say for example for marketing, but then you do agree that you are going to be maybe joint and separate controllers, right? Yeah, I mean, that is what I'd like to say for that so far without complicating it any further. What is important is that both parties share some common obligations, right? I've already touched on registration. Before you, the registration is actually a compliance issue, and you do need to find out whether or not you need to register. And of course, there are regulations around that. And what I've also noticed for those of you who have had interactions with the PDPO's office in Uganda or the ODPC, they do have, they're fairly accessible in the sense that they will answer your queries, they reply to your emails, and they have a fairly open office policy. So if you have any queries, by all means, contact them. The other common obligation is both parties, processors and controllers, they must respect the rights, the data protection rights as stipulated in the data protection law for the data subjects and the individuals whose the data they process, okay? In Kenya specifically, both data processors and data controllers are required to maintain a data retention schedule. I believe my colleague, you did touch on data retention schedule, but you cannot, what data retention schedule is you cannot maintain data forever, right? So you have to make sure you touch on, make sure you have specific time periods, how long you're going to maintain the data. Say, for example, I have seen some of my clients, say, for example, in the HR department, when you get an employee or get a candidate who is applying for a job. So say if you have a job application, you get, say, 1,000 CVs, and then out of the 1,000 CVs, only 5 are successful. So you got to make sure that from the data of those 900 or 995 plus CVs which you have received, those are candidates who are unsuccessful, right? And you cannot have the same data retention as the one for the employees, right? Who have been contracted by you, who by law you can keep for 6 or 7 years. So that is how detailed you need to be when maintaining data retention schedules. I do find that even in terms of data retention schedules, a lot of the organizations I've dealt with who are processing CCTV, And CCTV takes your, it does. They also process facial recognition, voice recognition. I do find sometimes the period for data retention of the CCTV footages is highly excessive. I have dealt with a client this morning who told me that they retained the CCTV footage for 90 days. I said, what are you going to do with the CCTV for 90 days? So there was no explanation, right? So the first step you need to do is any data you are going to be retaining as a data processor or a data controller, you need to ask yourself, first of all, what is my lawful basis? Secondly, how long am I going to retain it for? That is for the data retention. Once the data retention period lapses, you need to ensure that the data is either erased or it is fully anonymized. Anonymization, I said, I believe in my last webinar, it is not an easy concept. It is very, very difficult to anonymize. But then, should you be successful in anonymizing data, then of course you can keep it forever, and it ceases to become personal data. But again, anonymization is very difficult. Even in some of these developed countries, they are still struggling with how to anonymize data. Okay. The other obligation is sharing of personal data with third parties. So the data controller and data processor may share data with third parties, and as you've said earlier, that some of them may be sub-processors, and they may also be deemed as joint controllers. Okay. You've also touched on the written agreement, and I will come to the next slide. I will come on the written agreement, what you specifically need in those written agreements to be valid and for purposes of enforcing your rights and responsibilities in those agreements. What is important to say at this stage is a processor may not enter, shall not enter into an agreement for sharing with any third party without the consent of the controller. The Kenya Data Protection Act does not state written consent, but it is a highly recommended practice to have written consents in place, because tomorrow, if your organization is a controller, you will be under the duty and to prove that you did receive, that you did give consent to the processor. Okay. The Data Protection Act Kenya also mandates data controllers and data processors do need to have a data protection policy in place. This is an overarching organizational data protection policies, and they're regularly required to update and review the policies so that they are in tandem with the current data protection laws. In addition, though it is not a requirement under at least under the Kenya Data Protection Act, it is advisable for organizations to publish policies such as privacy policy, privacy notice, data and information security policies. As you said earlier, privacy policy, privacy notices, these are actually your obligations under the principles of data protection, which state how are you going to lawfully and transparently inform the individuals whose data you are processing, right? The last two areas I'll be touching on the obligations, joint obligations of data controllers and processors. One is to do with automated decision making. And so basically automated decision making is any decision made without human involvement. That is a global definition, acceptable definition of automated decision making, and I'll explain that further. Should you decide that you are going to hire an employee and have some form of machine learning, and then you feed that machine with the employees, say the candidates' name, gender, date of birth, race, locality, and then other forms of personal data, and then that machine comes up with the decision that you are going to hire this person or not, that the individuals have the right to know. It's not prohibited, but they have the right to know, right? And you need to conduct what you call a data protection impact assessment prior to any automated decision making by any form of artificial intelligence. Most importantly, of course, everything is important, but one of the most important areas which is now coming up considerably is that there is called data nationalization, right? And that is localization of data, right? In all data protection regimes, I have seen that a majority of them are asking for certain types of data to be stored locally. So in Kenya, for example, you have to store sensitive personal data locally. Sensitive personal data is, say, for example, gender, your race, your property details, your family details, sexual orientation, unless you have the consent of the data subject, okay? Now, some of you must have heard about this case of Schrems 2, which is a European case, and where at the moment there is a huge tiff going on between Europe and US data protection in terms of transferring data from Europe, which is under the GDPR regime, and the US, which does not have a federal data protection law. So at the moment, localization and international data transfers are one of the most hotly debated topics, which both controllers and processors have to be aware of. So even in the Kenya, all controllers and processors must make sure that when you're doing international data transfer, are there any localization rules in your country, okay? And this can even apply between Kenya and Uganda, for example, and Kenya and Tanzania. So for example, Tanzania does not have a data protection law yet. So if you have a processor based in Tanzania, you're based in Kenya, controller is based in Kenya, so you need to make sure that you have commensurate data protection or adequate safeguards when you transfer the personal data. We will be talking about international data transfers, adequate safeguards in the future webinars. So please stay tuned to those webinars. Okay, now we will move on to the controllers and process agreements. Thank you. Right, let's start with the agreements. This is a bit of a fun part. But what I'm going to do is I have divided this into 3 specific areas for trying to simplify it. So there is a focus area. We have the important areas. Of course, the entire agreement is important, but then for purposes of the data controllers and a data processing agreement from a legal perspective, these are the important. And then if there is termination, what are each party's obligations, okay? So let's start with the focus part. So the focus part, the scope and the application of every data processor, data controller agreement has to be very specifically defined. It has to be applied to the processing of personal data, and the definitions in the scope and the application of that agreement, you make sure what data is going to be processed. So for example, sensitive personal data has geographical differences. So if I can give you an example, in Kenya, property details, family details are sensitive personal data. I'm not sure if that is the case in Uganda, but it is certainly not there under the general data protection regulations. So it would be wrong to assume one generic definition of a data controller and a data processor, okay? There are some jurisdictions of data protection laws. So they have also got the definition of what we call data in transit, okay? And then some of them even have the definition of data intermediary. So you got to ensure that the scope and the definitions and the application of the processing of personal data and the definitions are very, very accurate, okay? Secondly, the controller's written instructions. These instructions is not necessarily just on the body of the agreement. I have seen, like, for example, I did touch on data sets. So for example, if you are going to be using certain data sets for one purpose, and then say, for example, sale of goods or providing services, and then how long you're going to retain it for, And then you can have another data set. So for example, if you are going to anonymize that data, you need to provide a data set to your controller if you're a processor. But then if you need it for statistical purposes, you need to then identify that data, that this particular data set we are going to anonymize fully, and then we will provide an anonymized data set, and then we will keep that for statistical purposes. And you got to have the controllers consent to do that. Okay, so the agreement might sometimes, I have seen some template agreements. My recommendation is that not to go on the template agreements. Make sure you read through that agreement very, very thoroughly, because when a breach arises, all these questions will be asked. Okay, going to the applicable data protection laws. As I alluded earlier, every country has, although the global template in data protection is a GDPR. However, you will find some very subtle and important differences, right? So you need to identify where data is being transferred to, right? Or where the data is going to. I was reading an article yesterday on, a lot of you must have heard this thing called metaverse, right? So people are now grappling as to how are you going to have data protection applied to metaverse, because I can be based in Nairobi. The data is being processed in, say, in Cambodia. The individual is based in US, but then the processor is based in Europe. So which data applies? Okay. At the moment, in as much as it seems complicated, it is not as complicated as it's going to be in the future. So what is more important is from now on, you need to identify which data protection law is applicable. Look at those laws, get your expert advisors to advise you, and then incorporate that in the agreements. Cooperation with the controller. A processor is always obliged to cooperate with the controller. This is especially when it comes to data subject rights and breach reporting, right? So for example, when an individual comes and says to a processor that I'm going to, can you please erase my data? Can you please rectify my data? The controller is obliged to immediately inform the controller as well the processor is immediately obliged to inform the controller that I received this request. And you are the controller, so you give me instructions how I have to deal with it, okay? And also breach reporting, right? So for example, controller has to report the data breach within 72 hours on becoming aware of that breach, okay? To the regulatory or the supervisory authority. The processor cannot go directly to the data, so the supervisory authority. This is certainly the case under the General Data Protection Regulation and the Kenya Data Protection Act, and I believe there may be a similar provision in the Uganda and Rwanda Data Protection Acts. So you have to report, the processor has to report to the controller within 48 hours of becoming aware of that breach, okay? Coming to warranties, any processors who are engaged by the controller must give sufficient warranties to the controller. Warranties in terms of that the employees of the processor, for example, are sufficiently trained to adhere to the data protection laws. It has similar safeguards in place as the one which the controller is expecting. And it has also got the appropriate technical and safeguards and organizational safeguards in place. Okay, so that is what I said to say on the focus part. Coming to the again the important part, although again there will be a bit of overlapping between both. Controller is under an obligation to make sure that a data processor is properly vetted. What I mean by vetted is, of course, you're going to take their documentation, the registration details, where they're based. I have seen clients who are using cloud-based services, but those clouds have absolutely got, the cloud is based in jurisdictions which have either no data protection laws and there are no proper agreements in place. What happens is that in case of a breach, it actually stops on the desk of the controller. So you as a controller have to ensure that the processor is vetted in terms of the data protection laws in your country as well as in the country where they are. And they have got all their necessary safeguards in place, okay? And then regularly make sure they're audited to make sure that they're following, and then the vetting of the data processor and whatever vetting processes you've undergone, documented. Because tomorrow, if there's going to be any form of audit or a breach, you will be asked that how did you vet this processor if there's a breach from there, okay? Apportionment of liabilities. This is especially specifically important in the event of a breach, right? So, for example, if there was a breach, if the processor took all the precautions and there's a breach on the part of the controller, obviously they cannot hold the controller liable. If there was a breach on the side of the processor, vice versa applies, right? So you got to have those apportionment of liabilities in place. Obviously, apportionment of liabilities can you can state in an agreement, but that will always depend on the facts of each case. So you got to identify, investigate the breach, and then decide from there who is going to be liable. Indemnity is an extension of apportionment. So, for example, once a data processor or a data controller is found liable, especially if it's a processor, the processor has got to have sufficient indemnity, give you sufficient indemnities, right? In terms of if you are responsible to a data subject in the event of a breach. Again, the indemnities are just as good as the processor themselves. Tomorrow, if the processor for any reason goes on liquidation, again, it becomes difficult to enforce those indemnities, but again, that is another discussion altogether. But then it's important for purposes of data control and data processor agreements to have your indemnities properly in place. Notification obligations, I've already touched on this. There is certain time frames, certainly under the GDPR, Kenya Data Protection Act, Uganda Data Protection Act, and I believe under the Rwanda Data Protection Act, that you must notify the regulatory body within certain time frames. If you are unable to notify within certain time frames, you have to give a very, very strong reason to the regulatory bodies or to your controllers why you did not do that. There is absolutely no excuse not to notify unless you have a very, very strong reason. Some of the highest data breaches and fines which are levied globally is a failure to even just to notify. You do not have to notify of the entire data breach. You can even tell the regulatory bodies that, look, we are still investigating. We believe there is a breach. We believe we need to notify. We will come back to you. But that notification must be within that certain time frame, right? Appointment of sub-processors. You, myself, have both touched on this. So all I'll state in this is basically that these are you need instructions from your controllers to appoint sub-processors. And again, those sub-processors must adhere to the same type of safeguards, laws, and under the same obligation, and probably enter into the same similar data processing agreements with the processors, right? So the whole chain between controller, processor, and any sub-processor has to be very tight so that there is no form of leakage in terms of data or any form of conflict between their agreements. Okay, I'll now move on to the third limb, termination. There are specific areas in data processing, data control agreements. You need to be careful, right? So, for example, sometimes when you're drafting data protection agreements, I already said the laws are becoming so dynamic that they're actually changing, if I can even put it this way, daily. Okay, so once you identify that a certain law is applicable, and you need to make sure they do not conflict with any other provision in the data protection law of the country where the processor or the controller is, or any other laws, right? So again, you will need specialist advice to make sure that if you are putting a certain data retention period, say of 6 years, and then the law in another country where the processor is sitting says 4 years, you go to make sure that you make sure you take you give a reasoning why you're going to 6 years or why you're going to take 4 years, right? Or alternatively have in the schedule that the data processor in that country can keep it for 4 years because this is what the law says or the Employment Act states, and here you can keep it for 6 years. It is that form of granularity you will need. Mediation and out-of-court procedures. This again is an extension of the global nature of the data protection laws. So once you have decided exactly what are going to be the laws, and you go to have mediation and other out-of-court procedures in place. So in the event of a dispute, expert arbitrators and mediators are more suitable and less expensive to resolve disputes and not the courts, right? Post-termination obligations. This is also specifically important when it comes to in the event of a termination. So for example, whenever a controller has entrusted data for purposes of processing, during vetting, they go to make sure that they have their post-termination obligations in place practically. So for example, when data controller, when the agreement is terminated, the processor in normal circumstances usually is obliged to delete or return the data, keep that data confidential, not to contact any form of data subject, retain that data only for a specific period of time. So all those post-termination obligations have to be in place as well. Okay, and finally, the applicable jurisdiction, right? Those of you who are contract lawyers, arbitrators, international arbitrators, you'll know that in any contract, parties are free to choose the jurisdiction applicable in the agreement, okay? However, we have to be a bit more practical. For example, if a controller is based in Kenya and a processor is based in Uganda, Tanzania, the applicable jurisdiction for purposes of the agreement can be Kenya or Uganda. So you're going to decide what is going to be the competent court of which is going to be hearing the disputes if you reach the dispute, which is going to be the seat of arbitration. It's going to be London, it's going to be Nairobi, it's going to be Kampala. You got to make sure you go to have all that in place. And yeah, I think that will be the last one. So that brings me to the end of this slide. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amit. So as we said, you can also join our next webinar. You will have more information on how to set up a privacy framework. And this is on how BDO can assist you in the meantime. We talked about information mapping and gap assessment to really identify your gaps in your organization and to be able to mitigate your risks. So of services that BDO offers to you include gap assessment, data protection, remediation. So we do also a lot of drafting and implementation, drafting of privacy policies, internal policies, privacy notices that you can upload on your website, and as well as those contract clauses that Amit has been covering. We have also a lot of experts who can really help you in drafting and implementing those policies and procedures within your organization. We also do data protection audits because, as you know, privacy compliance is not just a one-off thing that you can check off your list, but it is also something which needs constant monitoring and which needs ongoing supervision. So we also do data protection audits to ensure that even after you have implemented a privacy framework within your organization, you can you can be sure that the privacy controls are still up to date. And then we also offer services as an outsourced data protection officer. So there are requirements under the law for certain organizations to appoint a data protection officer. Even when there are no requirements, a data protection officer is always helpful in advising the organization when it comes to data privacy compliance. They can provide advice on where and when to implement contracts, on how to conduct data protection impact assessments, on how to respond to data subject rights requests, and so on. So BDO also provide this service, so we can act as data protection officer for your organization and really work together with you in this journey for data protection compliance. And then we have some tailor-made trainings and workshops applicable to the data protection sphere. So we have data inventory workshops, staff awareness trainings, privacy tools training. So if you need any of that, you can always contact us, and we will be happy to provide you with same. Right. So these are our contact details. So you can always contact Zahir, partner at BDO East Africa. You have his email right here. Or you can also contact Sylvie, who is our compliance partner here in Mauritius at BDO IT Consulting, and you have her email address shown up on the slide as well. So before closing this webinar, we'll take some few questions.
Yes, good evening and morning, afternoon from wherever you are. We really appreciate you holding here and keeping time with us. I know we're past time because we're supposed to finish up by 3:30. My name is Virginia Mwangi. I'm the one who's sending most of your responses via email. On Q&A, most of you have gotten your responses from you or Roshta, but we'll take a few that have not been responded to on the chat section. Linus Nyaga asked, can an organization that decides what data to collect and how to collect, but also has mechanisms on how to store, secure or manipulate the data within its framework, be considered for registration purposes as both a data controller and a data process?
Yep, so I'll take that question. Yep. So hello Linus, and the answer to that is yes, you can be both a data controller and a data processor. For example, you can be a data controller with regards to personal data of your employees. If you are processing personal data of your employees, you are making the decision on what is the purpose and how to process that. You are a data controller, but at the same time, you can act as a data processor for another organization. Whatever service that you provide to that organization, if you are receiving instructions from them, so you can also be a data processor. And at the same time, then you need to be registered as both a data controller and a data processor.
All right, second question from Linus also. Can a data subject be considered to have given consent where they have chosen not to opt out of a service where an opt-out option was provided?
Yep.
Yes, please.
Sure. Hi, I can take that?
Yes, please.
Hi. Yeah, so thank you for the question. Good question. It often it is asked. Now, consent has to be explicit, it has to be voluntary, and it has to be given in the language which the data subject understands. So there cannot be any check boxes, for example, right? So when you take consent of the data subject, you cannot assume consent. And if there is any form of question that tomorrow that the person withdrew the consent and they were still receiving, say, for example, marketing emails, the burden of proof is on the controller or even the processor that they have to prove that that consent was withdrawn or that consent was properly taken. So to answer your question, no, you cannot assume or you cannot say that that opted in because they're not opted out.
Okay, thank you so much, Amit, for that. We'll take just 2 more questions and then we'll call you today. What is the likely impact of data protection laws on adoption of artificial intelligence and machine learning dimensions? Isaac Nduvi asks.
Yeah, so for any new technology that you have, and that's why, you know, the data protection laws have introduced that you have the data protection impact assessment. So you need to do an assessment to really understand the risk that those new technologies represent on your data subjects, that they represent on your customers, your employees, and everyone for whom you process and collect personal data. So what is a data protection impact assessment? Generally, it will include a general description of the processing activity. It will include a description of the security measures in place in order to protect the personal data of those individuals. And you can also consult with the data subjects in order to have their views and in order to understand their understanding with regards to new technologies. So whatever new technology, new business operation, new service that your organization is trying to implement, it is always good for you to do a data protection impact assessment first, so that you are sure that that business operation or that technology is in line with data protection laws.
Okay, thank you so much, Hugh. Thank you so much, everyone, for this webinar and also our attendees. As you had mentioned, our 3rd episode will be on 28th of September. This recording is live on our YouTube channel, so you will find the recording there. You can always revisit to if you need to refresh your memory on a few things here and there. So we'll hope to see you next time. If your question has not been addressed, you will be responded to on the email that you used to attend this webinar. Thank you for joining us and see you again on the 28th of September.